Jatan, hi, good to have you with us. How have you been?
Hey Ashu, I've been good. How are you doing? And thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be on the show.
Lovely, Jatan. We're equally excited to have you with us, right? We've been doing a lot of sessions with and interviews and interactions with, founders of various D2C brands, right? Surprisingly, we've had very or no interaction whatsoever with the founder, in the oral hygiene and dental space as such, right? I'm surprised, when I look at the universe of startups within that zone, I'm surprised that there are not a lot of players who kind of exist, right? There have been some attempts, but these are attempts that have fizzled out, right? And it's a tough market to brave, right? And I think that makes this conversation all the more interesting. We're going to look to discuss a lot of those nuances, right? It's an emerging market, it's an interesting market, but like I said, it's a market with a lot of pains and challenges and pre-established, uh, thought processes, credibility, engagement, right, which is carried for such a long time, right? Generations to generations, right? It's a complicated market to be in, right? And you've really chosen a difficult battle, right? All of
No,
this put
absolutely.
together makes it a very interesting discussion.
No, absolutely. I think more like a consumer when I was starting to look at, what problem do I need to solve for? I was just appalled at the scenario of oral care in India, right? It just felt
Right.
that today I have an option to consume the best of products and brands across categories, whether that's my tea or my coffee or my skincare. But oral care hadn't really moved. And more like a consumer, I started thinking about the problem
Right.
rather than an entrepreneur, I would say. But like you mentioned, it's an emerging market. It's a very tough market to crack. And hence, as on today, you don't know or you wouldn't be aware if there's any other brand or a startup that is trying to do what we're trying to do in this category.
And what's an entrepreneur without challenges, right? I think that's another part of it, Jatan. Jatan, before we start this conversation, I think I'd love you to give us a quick background. You've been in the startup ecosystem for the longest time, right? You've served in many key positions, critical positions. You've seen very interesting growth curves, right, across organizations. I'd love you to give us a background on that, and then we move into our conversation of Perfora.
Sure, sounds good. So, Ashu, I come from a fairly small industrial town on the border of Maharashtra and Telangana. Born and brought up there, moved to Nagpur for my high school and then moved to Delhi University for my undergrad. Post my undergrad at Delhi University, I started working with this organization called Ernst& Young as part of their audit team. Fairly
Right.
quickly, I understood and realized that two things. One, I don't like being a very small cog in the wheel. And second, more about that I couldn't really gauge what my contribution was to the larger scheme of things, right? Because you're
Right.
doing some clerical work or some back-end work. 2015 was also a time when a lot of venture capital money was being invested in India. I was very curious and intrigued, how do you go about building a venture capital backed business? Because my
Right.
father had been a first generation entrepreneur, and I saw him building his business brick by brick by reinvesting profits in the business. So what he took to achieve in the 20 years, I was seeing that companies were doing that in 5 years or so. So that sort of curiosity led me to sort of start working with a very early stage startup called Coho. It was a community living startup which was trying
Right.
to standardize the long stay accommodation play in India, more like what Oyo was doing in the short stay accommodation. Coho was trying to do
Right.
that in the long stay rental accommodation piece. Did that for a year or so and realized I love the early stage grind and early stage hustle that requires in 0 to 1 stage.
Right.
Post that, I ended up joining as a founding team member at this brand called Akiva Superfoods, which is pioneering health shots as a category in our country, right? The idea
Right.
was, Ayurveda is a very integral part of our upbringing and culture, but it hasn't really moved with in the same direction as we have moved as individuals, right? So there was a gap
Right.
where the founder identified that, okay, today a lot of products that we have in urban households are not Ayurveda centric, and there is a
Right.
reason for it. So how do we go about solving for that?
Right.
And that's why the short format, amla shots, aloe vera shots in 40 ml ready to drink version came out. Did
Right.
that for 3 odd years, pretty much learned everything that I know today when it comes to consumer brand building during that stint. And post that, I wanted a different exposure and a different set of experiences. And that's when I joined this brand called Vadam Teas, which is
Right.
India's largest premium homegrown tea brand. They sell all over the world. So that was a very unique and novel experience for me of, how do you go about building a consumer brand operating out of India and selling across the world, right? They sell in more
Right.
than 100 countries today. So that's been a little bit about my journey so far.
Interesting. That's a lot, right? That you've covered in a very short while, Jatan, right? And not a lot of people can actually, boast, rave about, and talk about these complexities, the smaller pieces that generally go overlooked, right? When you're kind of building for a market like India, as complex and, and like I said, right, as diverse, because each of these problems are, have their own challenges, right? As you go on to scale, right? And we'll try and sort of cover some of that, through the course of conversation. How are you implementing all of that in Perfora, right? Perfora, right? But this is my first question in this conversation, right? And this conversation largely is going to be to understand, what's happening, what's not happening in the business, right? How large is the market? And that becomes my first question as well, right? How large is this market, right? I mean, typically when you look at oral care and dental care, right? Now this is something which is established for the longest time, right? I mean, this is like a pre-independence. There have been brands that have been pre-independence that have continued, right? We've lived with those brands. They've become part of us. This is not, I mean, when you talk of other startups, right, essentially kind of look at how underserved that market is, right? Now, this is not necessarily a very classical underserved market, right? I mean, this is something which is, one of the most basic things, as basic as, say, a toilet is, right? Which the PM has gone out to sort of talk about, and that possibly is more underserved than say, oral care, right? As a market, as a space, accessibility, pricing. Where are we on that front, right? When you look at that market, how do you basically dissect that market?
There are two ways to look at it, right? One is that I can talk numbers that, helps you give an understanding of how big the market is in terms of quantification. But the very interesting part, at least that's what got us excited when we started building Perfora, was you might not use an audio product every day. You might not use a skincare product every day. You might not wear the same sneakers every day, or you might not even wear sneakers every day. But oral care is something that you will use day in and day out, right? So it's a product that requires everyday usage, right? It's just become a very integral part of our everyday life. And we are a country which is of 1.4 billion population, right? Even today, if you look at it from a numbers point of view, only 60% of our country uses a toothpaste, right? So there's a lot of penetration that is yet to be done in the remote parts of our country, which either don't have access to a good quality product, or they don't have the resources to sort of buy such product, or there is a massive lack of awareness as well, right? Why you should be using a toothpaste, right? Why doesn't a neem datun or a neem stick does the job? Right. So that is how big the market is, right? There's a lot of potential, and I still feel I'll sort of disagree to some extent that the market is still underserved, right? It's about the proposition that you bring to the market, but there's a lot of potential to go out and build something unique and very exciting. And from a numbers point of view, as on today, the organized oral care market in India is about 15,000 crores, right? It is growing at about 9% CAGR year on year, and it's supposed to be a 25,000 crore market by 2027. So, yeah.
Interesting. But tell me this, right? I mean, when we talk of numbers, right? This is like a classical, issue, right? I'm not going to call it a problem, right? But a classical issue, right? That we consider India as one large market, right? And I agree with that, right? At many levels. But when it comes to dissecting this market, when it comes to prioritizing the market, it's extremely difficult sort of a challenge, right? When you talk of oral healthcare, right? And I'm continuing to talk of oral healthcare. I'm talking about the legacy brands that have been there, right? The Pepsids of the world and the Colgates of the world. Today these are brands that are available at, say, a sub ₹5 price, right? They're not necessarily catering to an educated audience only, right? This is like a mass market play that they've built, right? When you say what you say, I understand that aspirationally you are also essentially in the same line where you want to build a mass market brand, right? I'd like to understand how are you prioritizing it, because like I said, right, you're going to need a lot more resources to go out and really cut for a 1.4 billion people market, right? It's a massive challenge. It's an extremely commoditized industry in many ways, right? Uppricing becomes a huge challenge. People have a very clear range that they want to operate in, buy in, right? They don't necessarily also consider us to be a priority in many ways, right? When it comes to, say, household spends that they do. What's your sense of it, right? How are you prioritizing? Which is the first set of customers that you're going to, right? Is it an urban elite, people like you and me, educated, online, digitally savvy, open to changes? But that's a very, very small fragment, right? Is that the audience that you're catering to, or are you going beyond that, saying that that's my first step, right? And eventually I'm looking at, say, emerging markets in tier 2, tier 3 cities, right? That's your next step. How are you prioritizing? I'd love to understand that.
So fundamentally, what I believe, Ashu, just to give you a macro level viewpoint, brand building is a longer term game, right? It does not happen in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, right? It will
Sure.
take us a decade to get where we want to get.
Right.
That's one. To start off, you're right. We are going after the top 30 million consumers in India, consumers who have access to, high quality products, consumer who have a good quantum of disposable income, consumers who have already upgraded other aspects of their life. They've already solved for their health and nutrition. They've already solved for their appearance to some extent. They are already using the best of gadgets that are out there. So we're going after that market because my understanding of consumer is that, it's like a Maslow's hierarchy, right? You have to sort of create and engage with the topmost layer in the pyramid so that the aspiration can trickle down rather than going bottom up, right? So it's a top down approach. We want to sort of build a brand for the top 30 million consumers in India, have that kind of resonance, have that kind of word of mouth going for us, because everyone, if you look at it, even in the lowest stature of people, right, in a country, always have an aspiration to move upwards, right? One of the reasons people move upwards, or that gives them confidence that they're moving upwards, is because when they're able to access the same kind of products or same kind of resources the other person who's higher in the hierarchy is accessing, right? So that's the way we are thinking about it for now.
Interesting. So now, that's an interesting point that you kind of highlighted, right? Now I'm gonna kind of dig in a little further, right? Because this is a very interesting conversation at many levels, right? Now, when you talk of the 30, 40, 50 million, right, who have access to, say, better life, right? Have higher disposable incomes. They're consuming, like I said, right, a lot of content, right? And 2020 has been a revelation in many ways, right? Because earlier we were an economy which was consuming a lot of localized stuff, right? We were very fragmented in many ways, right? Our supply chain was again, dissected or distributed across a physical, digital. A lot of that is now kind of shifted, right? Digital is becoming a primary sort of a play, right? One of the key observations that we've had, through, say, many conversations that we've had with founders, right, and a lot of data that we're looking at, the arbitrage between cities is kind of going down, right? The arbitrage between classes is going down. What that essentially means is that, there are a lot of global products that are available, right? Which people were not necessarily looking at, right? But given that they become information first, a lot of consumers today, especially the clientele that we are talking about, right here, the 30, 40, 50 million, are now consuming a lot of that content as well. How do you see that as competition, right? Because, like I said, right, there is a certain, or what you're saying on Maslow's hierarchy, right, is applicable to that audience as well, right? So, what, for example, happens in the US and Europe will essentially trickle down in the upper echelons within India, right? Because, like I said, there is a certain credibility and a view that they have on brands that have done globally better, right? Doesn't that puts you also in a very tricky position? Would love to understand that.
No, absolutely. So the way the global outlook is, right, when it comes to oral care, that oral care is very price sensitive and price driven market, right? And that is why you see not a lot of premium global oral care brands have sort of forayed into Indian market. Just to sort of give you an analogy, today as a consumer, you have an option to buy a face wash worth ₹100, but you also have an option to buy a face wash worth ₹2,000 India, or north of 2,000, for example, right? But as a consumer, even if you have access to the best of resources and you have like unlimited disposable income, you can't really buy a toothpaste for more than ₹1,000, right? And that too also will be imported in one form or the other, right? You won't get a toothpaste that is being sold on Amazon, gets delivered to you and which is north of ₹500, right? So I think there is a price bracket that's already existing. So to answer your question, I believe one, India is not limited by geography now, right? So even when we look at our consumers, we don't look at it from a viewpoint that our consumers are always going to be based in top 10 cities of India, right? Like I mentioned at the very start, I come from a fairly small town in India, and what I've observed during my upbringing, that there is a small portion or small percentage of every city, every town in India that can pretty much afford everything, right? And considering digital penetration has increased, accessibility to products have increased, e-commerce has expanded phenomenally. Even if you're sitting in the remotest part of our country, right, somewhere down south, which only has an access to a geo as a network, you can still order a product and get it delivered in the next 48 hours, right? Because you have the resources to do it. So that's how we look at it. We don't want to be a tier 1 brand. We want to be a brand for the top 30 million consumers in India, people who want to invest in better aspect of their health. That is how we look at it.
Got it. Interesting. I think that's an interesting point that you highlighted, Jatan. And I kind of agree with you, right? I mean, I come from a small town, grown up there, right? So I kind of understand where you're coming from, right? There's this huge, and I think 2020 has largely been responsible for this, and I think that essentially has become a formidable foundation for many brands, right? Because a lot of this audience is not, before they graduate into looking at international products, I think they will need a brand that they can engage with, and I think that's a very interesting space which is kind of opened up, right? And I think a lot of D2C players will build a very solid niche and an engagement in that territory, right? And COVID is not really going away, right? Supply chain again for international market, I think will continue to be not as smooth as what we would want it to, right? And I think that's an incredible time. Javan, now, when we talk of oral care, right, the other big issue, and we kind of alluded to it in our earlier point, right, is that of credibility. I want to actually focus on this particular point, right? Now, when it comes to beauty and skincare, when it comes to, anything which is D2C, OTC health, right? It requires a lot of credibility, right? To essentially go out and engage with the audience, right? I mean, the audience today has become accepting. It's become more aware, right? They know what they want, but it's still a massive challenge, right? That credibility crisis is something that you have to deal with day in, day out, right? And also because, a lot of D2C early stage brands are still smaller, right? Consistency becomes an issue. So there are a lot of those issues as well, right? And like I said, credibility is a critical aspect of it, right? I'd love to understand you. How are you kind of solving for it, right? And how big is this a problem? As at a distance, to me, it seems like a big problem, right? How do I go out and build that kind of relationship, right? Your communication strategy, your delivery, your packaging, I think the overall experience, post-purchase experience, I think it includes a lot of it, right? To build that kind of establish that kind of relationship, right? And it's not necessarily as frequent, right? You only get to engage in this particular category after a certain interval. What's your sense of it? How do you see this, right? And what are some of the things that you were doing to solve for this?
Fair point. And I think for me, the way I look at credibility is how can we establish trust within our consumer, right? Trust is the thing that we are more willing to solve for because we are a new age brand, right? Today, you have been consuming a Sensodyne or a Colgate or a Listerine or an Oral-B, etc. for X number of years, and today you see another brand that's coming up and forging a different narrative, right? You'll be a little cautious, should I buy, should I not buy, why can I trust them? So essentially what we're trying to solve for is we're trying to solve for trust, right? And if you can solve for trust, I think credibility will come in the process as our funnel expands and as there are more number of consumers who have bought our products and they're sort of raving about our products overall, right? So the way we look at solving for trust, I think historically oral care has been a very dentist-led communication, right? Every second brand, if you see, and what I can remember from my observations and what I can recall, every second brand would have a TVC which will show a dentist in it talking about 24-hour germ protection and dentist approved, right? That's the end game. Whereas we very consciously took a call that we don't want to have a similar communication. We want to tell people that one, we are going to be very transparent and honest about our products, right? So if you go on our website today, you can read each and everything that goes into our products, right? Whether it is what kind of ingredients, how are they made, why is it better, and what consumers are saying. All those reviews are 100% honest and verified reviews. That's one. Second, the way we are sort of trying to solve for trust is that we are very accessible to our potential consumers. So for example, today, if you buy an Oral-B, one, you can only buy an Oral-B from an Amazon or an offline retail store. Second, before you buy an Oral-B electric toothbrush, I'm just taking electric toothbrush as an example because we receive a lot of queries for this particular product where people have certain inhibitions, right? Because they've been used to using a manual toothbrush for all their life, and today they're fancied or they just want to upgrade to electric toothbrush, and they have a certain set of questions. How is it going to work? Why is it better? How long will it last? How do you compare this to a manual toothbrush, etc., etc. But when you're sort of buying it from an offline retail store, you don't have access to that information because the salesperson out there wouldn't know, right? When you're buying on Amazon, the only thing that you can do is read reviews, and reviews are very first person oriented, right? They are
Right.
not informative, I would say. Correct.
Right.
And you can't really connect with the Oral-B customer care to sort of call them up or drop them an email and they'll respond to you, right? That's
Right.
not going to happen, at least in this decade, I feel so. So point being, when a customer reaches out to us, they can sort of engage with us via an Instagram DM, they can engage with us via WhatsApp, they can just call up us, or they can email us, right? As a founder, or as a founding team that we are very accessible and very responsive, right? I myself,
Right.
as a founder, end up doing about 4 to 5 calls every day, of end up taking inbound queries of 4 to 5 people who want to inquire more about products and understand why these products work than what's already out there. So I think that
Interesting.
information dissemination is really helpful and helps us establish the trust. Apart from that, if you look at our communication or packaging, because something that you talked about, with every package we send out a letter, right, which just talks about our story, that we're very consumer led. In that
Right.
letter, you also get, again, which is a very novel factor if you look at it, right? Okay, you might be a consumer of so many D2C brands. We put out our email IDs out there, right? As founders, hey, jatan@perforacare.com. So if you face
Right.
any issues, right? If you face tiniest of issues, just drop me a note and I'll personally
Right.
look into it, right? So
So
that's a
sweet.
mark of assurance for the customer that, okay, hey, this company is not going anywhere.
Right.
So I think that really also helps to instill the trust within the consumer. And
Interesting.
even from a communication point of view, we do a lot of communication via email with our consumers, right? Consumers who've already bought into our premise, talking about who are we as a brand, right? What do we do
Right.
different? Who am I as a person, right? So we have a emailing list of about 8,000, 9,000 folks as on today, and every
Right.
single person who would have read our email would know a lot more about Jatan than people who went to college with Jatan, I would
Interesting.
say, right? Because
Interesting.
they just
Interesting.
know about me, my journey, my family, my siblings, my dad, etc., right? And what do we do day in and day out? So I think
Interesting.
putting my personality, or putting our personality out there within the consumers, that just makes the conversation very real and very humane, I would say.
Interesting. Now, Jatan, this is a very, I mean, as somebody who's, like I said, right, who's passionate about D2C, I love D2C as a space, right? I love the creativity which goes into, building D2C companies, right? It's heartening to see a lot of what you're saying, right? But that's not necessarily true for a consumer, right? Essentially, oral care in his or her life is those 5 minutes in the morning and possibly 5 minutes in the evening, right? The world essentially now, and I find this to be a little complicated, right? From a D2C brand standpoint, right? And when I talk to a lot of founders, right, including yourself, you know, the assumption and the perception is that this is something which is possibly the most serious issue in that individual's life, right? While it's not, right? The ability and the patience that individual requires to consume a lot of this content is actually reducing drastically, right? They're essentially consuming just about a 30-second video, right? The content, for example, the has the, the nuances in content, for example, changed completely, right? Long form content is kind of going away. Do you think when you have a communication strategy, which is, say, for example, that in depth, that long form, is that right to build those relationships, to build those engagement models? The other question, as a subset of this question, right, is that while, of course, I know that Jatan is doing a great amount of work, right? He's sending me a personalized letter. As a consumer, I want my product to function, right? Now, I'm not taking it away from you, right? Which means, and I derive that from a very fundamental fact that there is a certain price that I paid, there is a certain outcome that I want. I want to feel fresh by the end of it, right? I just want that, and I want the brand to do that, right? Do you think a lot of this, for example, communication that we build around it, this entire engagement that we build around it, right? Or for example, the ingredients that go in, I as a consumer might not necessarily be interested in knowing all of this, right? At the end of the day, I just need a great product which just solves my purpose best. End of story. I move on. I order the next time. I hit like one button. I'm done, right? That's my relationship, right? Which is unsaid, unsung, but amazing, right? And consistent. How are you dealing with all of this, right? Because this is fairly complex, right? And of course, I'm not talking about the India level complexity, right? That comes in with languages, our preferences, and all that, right? That's a completely different, ball game, right? But here, how are you doing this, right? I'd love to understand that.
No, I think fair point, and I resonate with your viewpoint that long form content is going away. People, the attention span of consumers is drastically reducing, right? And since there is abundance of content available, they only engage with the content that resonates with their personal preferences. Very interestingly, what I've observed, and this is coming through research and through conversations with a bunch of different folks, is that the content format does not matter, right? If you have the right hook, if you have the right narrative, it will just make the consumer curious enough to read more or learn more about you. And I think that, so for example, I'll give you something that I'll talk about an experiment that we ran. So as on today, you ask any digital marketer, they'll say video over static and static over text, right? And it has to be more visually. It cannot be a text-based oriented communication. Personally, over the last 6-7 months of building Perfora, what we have seen, if we do something that's text-based, right, whether that's a Facebook ad or whether that's an Instagram post, right, or even that's newsletter for instance, it works beautifully well because our narrative is very different from what's already out there, right? We don't put out generic content from Google that, okay, Google says you should be brushing twice a day, 2 minutes, right? Or you should be rinsing twice a day and your mouthwash should be alcohol free, right? That's not the kind of content we put out, right? We put out content from our heart, right? So there's this ad that literally went viral to some extent where I had written a text-based ad talking about, why oral care is important to me as a person, because I don't have great looking teeth. And in order to do that, you need to read more about this, right? Literally, it had more than 1 lakh views on LinkedIn, and our CTR and CPCs on the digital front were like phenomenally low from an industry standpoint, right? CTR was high, CPCs were low, correct? So I think that's my viewpoint on, if you put out a different narrative and the narrative is interesting and engaging enough, the format does not matter. The length of content does not matter. And to your point on personalization, the reality is, and I've spoken and thought about this pretty much in depth, initially you do things that don't scale. The reason you do those things is because you want to create a very strong community of evangelists for your brand, right? So for example, we are the only brand in the country that does a personalized toothbrush, right? So for example, if you want to order a toothbrush for yourself, you can get Ashu printed, or if you want to order it for your sibling or your spouse or your parents, you can get their name printed on it. Right now, Oral-B will never do it because they're at a massive scale, right? Considering we're subscale, or we're just getting started, we want to provide that extra delight to the consumer that, hey, if you want happy birthday printed on it, if you want to gift it to your partner on a Valentine's Day, we'll mention everything that's written on the toothbrush, so that toothbrush which you pick up every morning reminds you of the other person, right? The person who's gifted you, right? So all these things might not be scalable when like 2 years down the line, and that's understandable. But for the first 2 years of our journey, we have to create a community of people who will go and talk about, okay, hey, I tried out this oral care brand and I am just bang on flat on it, right? I love them to the T.
Jatan, I love some of those points that you've highlighted, right? But I think I'm going to abstain from gifting that toothbrush, right? I don't want the other person to feel that there is like an ulterior reason to it, right? And I think those are some very interesting nuances, right, that you have to possibly deal with. But I think I like the point that you highlighted, right, on the personalization front of it, Jatan. It's an interesting point, right? I think these are smaller things that really work well when you're going out and building that brand, right? I think for a mom to a daughter, from a mom to a son, right, and especially kids. I mean, I have a daughter, right, and I can when you say what you say, right, I can definitely see my wife doing that for my daughter, right? I think those are some special things that you want to do for your kids, right? And I think those are some, and I think that level and the layer of personalization just helps you build up a bond in a very different way, right? I think that's a very interesting point that you highlighted, right? So then we're gonna move a little away from of course discussing the challenges and and some of the things that you've done on building the brand, right? We're gonna talk about brands that are being built. And the challenges that brands are, for example, seeing in the D2C space, right? Now, there's a lot of money which has been poured into the digital environment, right? Essentially, channels of acquisition continue to be the same, right? Just about 4, 5, 6 of them, and that's very, very predictable, right? The newer brands are coming in, and this has become a game which is not about Jatan's creativity, right, or his ability to communicate with his customer. It's a game which is now moving into being driven by capital, right? So the more capital that you have in the bank, your ability to engage a customer is going to be higher, right? To retain talent, so on and so forth, right? Which is just taking away that creative element out of the business, right? Which is to me that's wrong, right? I think that creativity will really or should really differentiate between a commoditized play and a better thinking player. Uh, what's your sense of it, right? 2020 and onwards has been bizarre, right? The way the money's been poured in, the cost of acquisition is going through the roof, right? There's a lot of inconsistency when it comes to subscriptions, for example, right? In the consumer behavior, for example, right? The narrative is kind of changing very, very quickly. Uh, Preferences are moving very, very fast, right? People want to experiment a lot more, right? So we've become it's become very fuzzy in many ways, right? How are you looking at all of this, right? How are you, of course, you gave an example of how you, for example, did a piece of content, right? And that content got you virality, possibly help you build engagement, right? There's certain personalizations that you're doing, right? But what do you think of the capital injection that is coming into this particular space, right? The other thought that I have, and I would love you to answer this, right? Is house of brands are going to kill many, many standalone brands, right? For a lot of founders who are putting in the kind of hard work, even their ability to grow will eventually lead into an exit to a house of brands, right? Which is very limited, right? Or limiting in many ways, right? What is your thought around this?
Sure. So I'll go one by one, right? To your point on a lot of capital being poured in the market and CPCs and cost of customer acquisition going through the roof. That's as true as it gets, right? The environment is very tricky, and I would say even capital to some extent does not really solve the problem, right? Because even on a digital front, the way things work, it's very algorithm based, right? If a consumer does not engage with your advertisement, if Facebook or Google or YouTube won't show that advertisement to the same person ever again, right? Because the engagement was fairly low. So I do feel creativity is still a very important part of the overall process that helps the brand stand out and sort of beat the industry standards or industry benchmarks in terms of cost of acquisition. But all said and done, the way I look at it, Ashu, is that it's a well-oiled machine, right? When you're trying to sort of build something phenomenal, you need to have access to the right resources, right? That means you need to have capital in the bank. You also need to have the right set of creativity to lure the customer and entice the customer and acquire it and engage with that customer. So I don't think so it's either or. I think it's a combination of both. And with a lot of capital being poured in the market, I think that's good, right? Because a lot of brands are coming out with different strategies and they're expanding the horizon, right? So for example, I as a consumer would probably buy grocery 2 times in a month, right? But now I'm probably buying every second day because of the instant 10-minute grocery delivery, right? Because it's just so frictionless, right? I might be spending overall maybe 30% more on my grocery, but that's okay. Because I'm loving the hassle-free experience, right? That I don't have to plan it in advance and I don't have to make a trip to the neighborhood grocer, or I don't have to wait for 48 hours to get my groceries delivered, right? Which is again a mental task for someone like me. And I'm happy to pay or overspend 30% of my money on grocery as a spend, right? So I think with a lot of money coming into the market and a lot of awareness happening, because what will brands do, right? Brands will basically promote or talk more or advertise more about their proposition. That will just make consumers more aware, and that will entice a certain section of consumers to spend more in a specific category, right? And that is happening across categories. So unfortunately or fortunately, we are in a position where there's no oral care brands. For us, it's also a relatively a little challenging to raise a lot of money, because the way money flows into the market, it's also very trend driven, right? So example, if 10-minute delivery is the hottest thing, you will see millions of dollars being invested in it, right? If skincare or beauty is the hottest thing, you'll see hundreds of millions of dollars being invested in it, right? Oral care as on today is not the hottest thing, but again, that is our premise, that we are going to make oral care the next big thing, right, within consumer. So yeah, I think that's on your first point. What was the second point? Can you sort of rephrase?
The second point was that house of brands is now there are many house of brands that have come up, right? Now that essentially means that, and these are brands that have actually gone on to raise a lot of capital, right? And they've acquired some of these brands, right? And they're now kind of running it like any other large enterprise, right? I think the modus operandi is very, very clear. With the money that is being spent, right? And there's a possibility that it might not be coming into oral care right now, right? But eventually it will get there, right? I think the aspiration for house of brands is to acquire many, many of these brands, right? And make it like a one single unit, right? Which literally owns the consumer, right? Cross leverages each other, because eventually a lot of these brands will essentially be going after the same consumer, which is also the consumer that you were going after, right? Now, for a founder like yourself, right? And like you said, the capital is a big problem, right? And with all of this, while I agree with a lot of those points that you highlighted, Jatan, right? My issue is that, like I said, there are no fixed tendencies, right? There's just so much of communication happening, right? In case the numbers do not look consistent, capital could, businesses could have lesser capital, right? Which would mean that the functionality and ability to continue to sort of deliver that experience might get tapered down, right? That makes it very, very challenging, and that might just completely destroy the trust that we spoke on, early in the conversation, right? That essentially leads into early exits for founders even before they've seen the possible growth, right? Exiting into the house of brands, right? Much early on. Of course, not that the house of brands are going to buy out, any of the bad performing assets, right? It's just that uh, they still have the appetite to basically continue to have lower cost of acquisitions, right? Because, like I said, right, there's a certain portfolio that they built, they can cross engage, they can, build continuity across 2 or 3 products, right? By bundling it up. There are a lot of those permutation combinations, right? Doesn't that limit it as a journey for a founder like yourself, right?
I
Where your
think
eventual exit will eventually be to a house of brands, right? Is that a fair understanding or not a fair understanding, right? And the brands can continue to get built. There could be an independent path that brands could have. What's your sense of it?
no, fair point. And I think the way house of brands function, at least in my limited
Sure,
knowledge, is that it's a buy versus build decision for them, right? For any group,
sure,
whether they want to build something from ground up or whether they want to acquire another brand which is operating at a certain scale, so that they can, do a blitz scaling of the brand that they
sure,
acquire. Uh, to
sure.
your point on whether it is limiting or not, I do believe it is limiting. But at the same time, if the proposition from the some from a larger conglomerate, right, it's exciting enough that you'd want to give in, I think that's a fair call. Sometimes it's not about sometimes it's also not about the capital that is being offered, right? Because as a
Right,
founder, sometimes you do hit a roadblock. Where do I go from here, right?
right.
I don't only need capital, but I also need a lot of guidance, and I need a playbook to sort of crack, hypothetically speaking, crack offline as a market, or tier
Right.
2 distribution or tier 3 distribution or
Sure.
exports as a category, right? So a lot of capital, I might have a lot of capital in the bank, but if I can't deploy that capital efficiently, I'm not going to get anywhere, right? So when you get acquired by someone and they already have a playbook, because they operate across categories, they operate across channels, and they have that in-depth expertise, you benefit from them, right? And as a founder, you might even continue to play a very integral or a very vital role in the house of brands journey, because the brand might have been acquired, but you can continue to sort of lead that brand independently and grow it to probably XYZ million dollars.
Right.
At the same time, I also feel, there is a very strong way to build independent brands, right? That's not going to, like, if a founder definitely feels very strongly that they don't want to sell out or they don't want to get acquired, and they have a clear growth roadmap, how do they take their brand from 1 to 5x from here on, from the scale that they're at, I think they will just continue to build on their own.
Super, super. So then, I think I kind of I like that perspective, right? I think, and that's a fair perspective, right? It's not necessarily bad to have such larger players, right? Who you can possibly go out, collaborate with, be a part of, right? And continue to build that journey, right? Because there's a lot of intelligence that they bring to the table, and including capital, right? Becomes one, right? Now, Jatan, going to the numbers, right? Perfora has been there for some time, right? You have built a reasonable, engagement, right? There's a thick community which is there. Of course, it's getting thicker by the day. Um, what are what are some of the regions that have outperformed the expectations, right? You never anticipated that, these are regions that could do well. Across a lot of my conversations with a lot of founders, I have what I what I've heard and what I understand is that South has been exceptional, right, when it comes to adoption, and largely it's been a function of education, right? Because it's an audience which is going out, which is a little more aware of their requirements, is going and willing to go out and test, right? What's been your experience from that standpoint?
So from a number standpoint, I think we continue to see a lot of volume from the top 5-6 cities in India, and this is across Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore, Chennai, Hyderabad, Pune, etc. right? These cities have the right sort of audience that we're going after. They're evolved, they are technology oriented, they want to sort of reduce redundancies in their life, right? They want to sort of brush on one hand, probably checks their phone on the other hand, right? And they just want to make their life very convenient, right? They just want to make sure that everything that is an integral part of their everyday routine aligns with their central philosophy, right? Whether it is in terms of design, whether it is in terms of functionality. I think for us, it's been the top 5 cities for now, but very encouragingly, we're also seeing good adoption, right? So top 50%, the first 50% might be coming from top 5 cities, but the balance 50% is coming from towns and cities that I might have not even heard of, right? And we speak to those consumers to understand how did you discover us, and the end person says, I like what you put out, and I don't have access to that product in my neighborhood kirana. So I thought, this is the only way to go ahead and buy it, and I've bought it, right? And I'm loving the experience. So,
and which is that one city which has surprised you?
Which is that one city that surprised me? I think there was a city called Araria in Bihar. It's a very small town in Bihar that I wasn't even aware of, but I did see someone ordering. And I'll tell you very interesting, right? Not did the customer order once, right? That customer has ordered thrice. First, he ordered a single toothbrush. Then he ordered another toothbrush for other people in his households. And then he also bought the other products that we have in our portfolio, which is a toothpaste and a mouthwash and a teeth whitening powder, etc.
Right.
So
interesting. I think you have something there.
Yeah, so that is why what I mentioned in the early part of the conversation as well, that we're not limited by geography, right? We might be limited by disposable income to some extent, and that's a conscious decision that we've taken.
Interesting. So then, when we talk of audience, right, and of course, when we kind of talk of the demographic which we are kind of catering to, and when we talk of this engagement that you're seeing out of tier 1, tier 2, tier 1 cities, right, and they've been the early adopters, right? How large or how deep is this penchant to enter export markets, right? To enter global markets, right? Because all of what you're seeking in India already exists there, right? These are markets with higher levels of education, higher disposable money incomes, right? Access to credit. There is a certain behavior that is already there. Seriousness around life and health in general. There's a lot of those tick marks, right? Is there, how tempting is it to be there and not be there, right? In international markets.
No, to be absolute honest, it's very tempting, right? And considering that I spent some time building Vadam, right, which is a global tea brand, I also understand the challenges and the opportunities that exist in global markets. Fortunately, for a brand like us or the category that we operate in, oral care is universal. So, for example, our skincare is dependent upon the type of weather conditions that we live in, right? Our apparel is dependent upon the kind of culture that we live in, right? Whereas a toothpaste or a toothbrush remains same whether it's India or a US or a Europe or a Japan, right? So I think that's universal and that's very exciting for us. But though it is exciting, we're also cognizant of the fact that we don't want to be taking giant leap of faith when we're just starting out, right? We want to sort of have our learnings in place, understand one particular market, understand what worked for us, what didn't work for us, at what price points, what communication, and then execute or replicate the same strategy or a similar strategy for a different market. So far, I think US is highly penetrated in terms of oral care. There are a plethora of brands out there that are bringing forward a new and a different narrative. So it's very competitive. But there are other new and nascent markets that have not seen as much proliferation of oral care brands as a US or a UK or a Germany or France, right? These markets are Middle East, Southeast Asia, Singapore, Indonesia. So I think our first go-to step would be whenever we plan to go global, to launch in these markets, do a beta launch, do it online only, see what kind of response do we get, what kind of learnings can we accumulate in the first 6 months of our operation, and then thinking about what the right strategy for a specific market looks like.
Interesting. Jatan, we're towards the end of our conversation, right? A continued question, right? What are the next 2 years like? What are the numbers that you are chasing at Perfora, right? How large is the community? What's on the cards? I mean, I would have loved to ask you a 5-year question, but I think it's these are not the perfect times, right, to be asking a 5-year question. I think 2 years is a little more predictable, right? In many ways. So what are the next 2 years like? I'd love to understand that.
Yeah, no, I think, and I really appreciate that fact, because a lot of people ask 5-year questions, but they don't understand the shoes that we are in. We're just starting out. But the fact is, next 2 years are going to be very exciting for us. From a number standpoint, I think we want to be at a 45-50 crores in annualized revenue over the next 2 years. So I'm just talking about, March 2024 is when we are looking at hitting that number from a monthly revenue perspective, right? Which will be about 4.5 crores in monthly revenue. Right now, we're a very lean team and we are growing very fast. So our growth journey has been 100% month on month, and we're only a team of about 5-6 people right now that's doing a lot of heavy lifting. And the idea from here on, at least for the next 6 months, is to identify what products and what communications work for us, right? As a young brand with limited resources, our objective is, launch a bunch of very well thought out products at different price points, and understand what a consumer wants, right? Or what a consumer is more resonating with, or what a consumer is feeling the utmost need for from your brand. Once we get that clear indication, okay, hey, your electric toothbrush is world class, I can pay. The price does not matter because I'm in love with the product. We would want to scale that up like anything, right? We would just want to fly with it, right? And if that's toothpaste for us, we would want to do the same thing for toothpaste. So out of the huge portfolio that we're building right now, we already have about 12-14 products in our portfolio. We want to extend that to about 40-50 products in the next 2 years. We want to identify what products work and really scale them up and launch them in different markets, because we know the reality is we have to look for product market fit, right? If we don't have the product market fit, it will be like being a little naive in spending capital where we don't know whether it is going to give us any return or not. So that's
a difficult choice.
That's a very difficult choice, but I think with a lot of customer interactions and data, we can continue to sort of analyze and understand what works for us.
And when you say, these 5-6 people, right? I think I'm sure it's madness, right? In terms of, continuing to deliver the same experience, right? Doing it right every single time, and identifying the newer products that are going to come out, right? I think this must be insane, right? But I think the commitment is visible, Jatan. I think you
and really so are the dark circles, I would say.
Well, I think that's part of it, right? But I think there's nothing more exciting and nothing more satisfying than to really come, be in a position where you see what you've conceived of come through, right? In the eyes of a customer, a happy customer. I think that's possibly the most satisfying, right? I think that honestly makes those dark circles much smaller an issue in many ways. Jatan, last question. This is also very cliched. I'm sure you answered this on multiple occasions, right? And I am very keen for you to do this, right? Is because you've been in the startup ecosystem, you've picked up a mantle of solving a problem which is, like I said, right, it has 20,000 challenges, right? Some of them were discussed through the course of it, right? And fundraising is something which is important in today's time, right? Because everything is like kind of moving digital. It's very transparent. You need resources to build a brand. Right? There are many founders out there who don't necessarily dive into something because of the fear that this is something which is already being sold for. There are very large players, right? How am I going to go and raise capital because investors might not buy into my vision? It just becomes so much more challenging, right? Any advice, suggestion that you would want to give to founders who are in that space, looking to enter such a space, for some reason are on the fence, or have the fear that they might not get one piece or the other right? What would that suggestion, advice be? I'd love you to spell it out.
I think the only suggestion, again, this is something that I'm also learning every day, right? So I'm no expert per se, but what I'm realizing day in and day out, one has to realize what is their reason to win in the market, right? And to put out very simply, your reason could be as simple as you provide a similar quality product than what's already out there at a much better price point, right? Even that's a reason to win, because or you have that ability or expertise to bring the cost down of a certain product. Correct. It could be about, how are you elevating the overall experience with a certain product, right? So you might be using an AirPod right now, right? And there are 50 brands that sell an AirPod, correct?
Right.
There's a reason why you would have bought a specific brand, right? So that brand is solving that for you, right? Whether it's the design, whether it's the color, whether it's the functionality, whether it's the price point, whether it's the online distribution, correct? So
Right.
you could go out and say, okay, hey, I'm going to sell, and this is just a potential idea. I could go out and sell 10 rupees toothpaste in the parts of India where there's no toothpaste available, and I want to sort of cater to the remaining 40% of India that does not use a toothpaste. It might sound like a very upskill journey, but once you make those inroads, and once you know, okay, what kind of communication work, what kind of pricing works, what kind of audience that you're catering to, you will have a strategy for yourself. So I think it's just very important to realize why are you going to win, or why are your customers why are the customers, right, not your customers, going to prefer your brand over 10 other brands out there in the market? Because if you think that you have a unique idea that nobody else is going to replicate, I think that's never going to happen. I think if you're doing something right, there are people who are going to copy you and follow you and are going to be on a similar trajectory. So having that why to win as an answer in terms of your strategy is very important.
Interesting. I think that's an interesting point that you highlight, right? And I think I'll just summarize it by saying, just be in it, right? And I think understand those finer nuances, because a lot of large brands are not necessarily looking at, those very small nuances. They tend to overlook, right? And that's where an entrepreneur brings in a very key differentiation vis-a-vis, possibly a brand manager or an employee in an organization, right? Who's just kind of catering for the masses, not really looking at those small crevices which could blow up into a great opportunity, right? And I think that focus is very important. That depth and understanding that is very important. That observation is very important. And I think, just to sort of summarize what you've said, Jatan, it was a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking the time out. This was a phenomenal conversation. We wish you all the very best. We wish you all the very best. And I think this is an uphill climb. But we believe that the time is now, right? The consumer is changing, the consumer is evolving. Your ability to communicate, be it small, long, depending, of course, your strategy, right? And the sensitivity of the consumer. But like I said, the time is now. There is money which is available. Consumers are ready to spend. They are seeking more information. This education has done wonders, right? And we hope that the entire penetration of education increases, because that is going to be a solid foundation for many new brands to sort of come up, right? Ask right questions, and I think that drive of an entrepreneur is very important in a market like this, right? Those smaller opportunities will possibly become into very big opportunities. Something that you're kind of dealing with day in, day out. It was a pleasure to have you, Jatan. Thank you so much for taking the time out. Like I said, right, we wish you all the very best, and I would want this conversation to go on, because India is a very exciting market. It's a market where you can not have one conversation, right? You have to have many conversations to really sort of dissect this market, understand the complexities that this market brings together. A great first conversation, and look forward to having you for the second one very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashu, and it was a pleasure speaking with you. And I'd like to sort of put it out, it was a very unusual conversation, right? Your questions were very interesting. So I've personally enjoyed having a conversation where I was like, all these thoughts, keep mingling with me as an entrepreneur, right? What strategy, how do you look at global markets? But people don't usually ask that, right? So I'm glad that you touched upon these aspects in terms of communication, in terms of global markets, in terms of a bunch of other very interesting questions. So great chatting with you, man, and love to stay in touch and speak soon again.
Let's do that. Thank you, Jatan.
Thank you. Bye.